considered to be a very important conversation, like many others that if you've joined us, that deals with the Negro question. One of the things that we'll get through today is to deconstruct the idea of what radical Black pedagogies and their worth in a Eurocentric education or the system, as well as how we look at the legacy and how it all ties together to Malcolm X. So before we get started, Toby, if you can put up our poll questions. Can everybody here make sure to give your thoughts here? And I guess you know, Dr. Benson, you can't vote.
No problem. Happy to abstain.
Pretty interesting questions, huh?
Definitely.
And I hope this kind of shapes how we'll be able to introduce you and then move right into your research.
No problem. No problem.
So you think we need another minute?
Maybe give it another 20 seconds. That'll put us at 2 minutes and then I'll end it.
Okay, perfect. All right. We are ready to get started and to introduce our guest tonight, whose presentation will be one of those presentations that we're glad that he's here, number one, and then we're glad that we're recording this because it seems to me that when Dr. Benson comes out and presents his research, it's one of those things that requires that we go back over it and we're able to deconstruct it in a way that we hope that he will connect with us again to answer some of these questions that we hope that you pose right in the Q&A. So before we get started with this exact, as we begin, I want to go over Dr. Benson's bio and we'll begin like this. Dr. Benson is a historian of education, specializing in the Black freedom movement and transnational social movements. He completed a PhD in educational policy studies, specializing in the history of education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is currently an associate professor in the education department at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. He has received a number of grants, fellowships, and awards, including 2019-2020 Robert A. Corrigan Visiting Professor in Social Justice at San Francisco State University. We want to send a thank you out to Dr. Benson for that, and the W.E.B. Visiting Scholars Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2018-2019. He's award-winning author of The Fighting for Our Place in the Sun, Malcolm X and the Radicalization of the Black Student Movement, 1960 to 1973, which is a text that examines the linkages and intergenerational continuity of the Black freedom movement that evoked from social pedagogy and political influence of Malcolm X. Dr. Benson is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Funding the Revolution, Black Power, White Church Money, and the Financial Architects of Black Radicalism, 1966 to 1976. And we welcome you. So before we get started, thank you for being here.
Thank you
And
for having me. Thank you
Absolutely.
for having me, Dr. Dixon. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. The Black Studies Center welcomes you, and your scholarship is what resembles the fundamental
sir.
of what we want to do at the Black Studies Center.
Right.
So to
Right.
think about that and to think about taking on a topic to create a book, a manuscript, and then you look at Malcolm X. In many ways, Malcolm X is this iconic figure that many would say is oversaturated in some of the research that has been done with him. So how did you come up with this particular thought to add to the dominant narrative? But using Malcolm X is so very, not controversial, but it always lends this idea of critique, no matter how you cover Malcolm X, particularly when we think about the vein that's used by some of the nationalistic thoughts. And one might say they have gravitated towards removing the importance of the most honorable Elijah Muhammad from that particular thought. And, you know, you being from Chicago and a South Side native and being connected to many of those different spaces, what was the thrust behind the inspiration?
First and foremost, thank you for having me, especially during these very peculiar times with everything going on. It seems like whether it's institutionally or psychologically or, you know, dealing with some aspect or whether it's curriculum, things that point or some aspect of the barometer that points towards some aspect or area of Blackness seems to stay under consistent siege or constant siege. So I really thank you for even having me here, especially over the past, I would say 30 to 45 days, since some of the HBCUs, approximately 26, including mine, have been under consistent threat of violence as it relates to bomb threats, et cetera. So it's been a lot going on for the semester. So I'm really pleased, in addition to appreciative of being here to be able to present this work that, as I'm sure you told your students, is something that continues to be ongoing. So thank you. And, thank you to your students for being present in order to be able to, share some of what it is that I've just been able to cover for the past decade. So in terms of my work, I say one of the basic things that I was able to see very early with respect to the gravitas or the attraction, the general attraction that Malcolm had for me and so many other individuals, that just went beyond him being encapsulated or frozen in a specific pose of militancy, or this very pensive stare that he may have had that he's posterized on throughout the globe, and literally looked at as being the poster child for militancy and also Black power. For me, I think one of the basic things, and I'll cover this at some point of the presentation, was that I couldn't get over the fact that if you actually listen to Malcolm's speeches, in addition to watch, whether it's old video on YouTube, prior to YouTube, whether it was Message to the Grassroots or Malcolm X on Black Nationalism or Malcolm X Speaks, whatever that you could even access on long play record, the thing that was most attractive for me is that I felt like that I was in a class. So by the time I got to grad school or the doctoral program at the University of Illinois in Educational Policy Studies History, even before I knew I wanted to engage in historical methods, so even look at Malcolm and the Black student movement, what I did as a hobby in my spare time back in my apartment would just me listening to old LPs, old VHS, I still had copies of that, of Malcolm speeches, et cetera. And I would just wonder what it was like, what it would have been like to actually sit physically in front of Malcolm giving a lecture at one of the many universities and colleges for over the breadth of his career, which approximates globally about 65. And I thought, well, what I'm getting is, yes, it's a lecture, but my analysis based on the training as an academic has led me to believe that much of what it is that I'm facing at this point is someone who's now not only teaching, but providing a curriculum. And I think one of the most enthralling things about the attraction to Malcolm is that I realized that he had a pedagogical style. So the way that he taught, or the way that he literally approaches the art of teaching, is one standing and delivering, whether he's using humor, history, something socio-political, connecting it to something that would have been as nuanced as an anecdote, personal story, narrative, however that he was able to literally frame his lectures, his arguments, et cetera. I said, I'm watching someone teach. I'm listening to someone teach. And I felt that there was a philosophy, whether it was implicit or explicit, that he was expressing each time that he stood in front of young people, a church, YMCA, a crowd, et cetera, was able to literally convey a message. And I figured that this philosophical approach, or I would say the educational approach that he had, that identified as being a philosophy of not only instruction and also curriculum, but it led me to believe that this philosophy was also attractive enough for a subsequent generation in order to literally target Malcolm to be the individual who they felt would be most capable of being the muse that would guide them to some degree through what it is that we identify historically as this moment of Black power. So these are some of the basic things that I really wanted to remove Malcolm from just being someone identified as just political, or someone who, in a historical moment is branded as the individual that's the most militant and radical. I wanted the audiences to begin to look at him as someone who actually was an educator and an instructor. And what those influences is one who, standing in front of a classroom, was able to provide to his varied audiences, whether they were with the Nation of Islam, whether they were with young people in SNCC or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or with the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, or, in front of a church audience, et cetera. So I just figured that each time he was present, he was activating an aspect of himself that looked more like an educator than just someone who was a firebrand and providing a talk or a lecture. So those were my main points of attraction of Malcolm at a very early, I would say, stage of investigating his life's work as an educator.
Okay, Toby, can you allow for Dr. Benson to share his screen so he can get started?
So, Dr. Dixon,
yes.
I don't want to take up too much time in terms of like the general presentation, because I'm looking at my slides, because I do appreciate the fact that we're going to have some Q&A or be able to like engage in literal conversation based on my presentation.
Okay.
So how much time are you going to give me for the presentation? Because I don't want to go overboard and just turn it into a straight lecture. I really want to be able to engage in terms of conversation. So how much time do I have?
Let's say at this point, somewhere around 30 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Perfect.
Would that be all right?
Perfect.
You can get it done in that quick of a time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then we'll have some question and answers, and that'll bring us right around to our 1 hour mark.
No problem.
Thank you, sir.
He should be good to share.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm looking at the role of Malcolm, and I would say not only Malcolm and what it is that he was able to present or represent as a radical pedagogue, but the general legacy of radical pedagogies is Malcolm embodied that aspect of being an educator and not just a political figurehead as it looks at the Negro question and the general role as it relates to what Malcolm embodied with respect to being, I would say, the embodiment or a literal figurehead of someone who was antithetical to what it is that those nearly 100 years prior would have been able to conjure with respect to thinking about the so-called Negro in this space as something problematic. So what does Malcolm mean with respect to that particular legacy? So this is what I'm going to cover for the presentation. And in doing so, I'm going to tease out a few things with respect to Malcolm's ascendancy, but most importantly, his growth, and also what it looks like for someone like Malcolm to experience a particular grounding politically, a particular grounding socially, and what those intersections of his social, political, and then also I would also argue his geographic placement with respect to whether it being on the Upper East Coast or the Midwest also means as it relates to his understandings around the politics of place in terms of him moving forward as an individual who's identified as a leader, but also his future growth as well. So I'm going to tease out a few of these things for the presentation. So who was, Malcolm Little, who eventually became Malik Shabazz? Who was this individual who was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and whose family, for the most part, was plagued by violence because him being one of 7 siblings in this large family through which he was raised as an individual who's essentially one who's a byproduct of the Garvey movement. I mean, I would even argue that he's the embodiment of what it is that Garvey would have foreseen with respect to the subsequent generations after the UNIA have become, in terms of the explosion of Black consciousness, the explosion of the approach to what it actually meant to be not only someone who identified as an African domestically, but an African abroad, and wherever that you will find the diaspora presence of those who are from, the continent. So Malcolm, was an individual who actually had a number of stages with respect to his evolutionary development. And the stages of Malcolm's life are very, very key with respect to how it is that he approaches becoming an educator, even if he didn't necessarily explicitly say that he was a teacher or an educator, but the way that he actually engages and the love affair that he had with education are truly found at the beginning stages, or I would say at the beginning phases of his life and career. So let's look at something that I just wanted to interject. And normally I don't think too many people actually understand the role of his mother, but I think it's important with respect to understanding the role of what a radical pedagogy or the radical presence as it relates to a tradition within Black life, culture, and especially education, what it really means. So his mother, Louise Little, married to his father, Earl Little, was a woman of mixed ancestry, and to include European, French, and also First Nation or Indigenous background. So they meaning his parents met in Montreal at a UNIA meeting, or the Universal Negro Improvement Association meeting, which was the organization that was founded and led by Marcus Garvey. So they meet in Canada. And when they met, after that, then they moved around New York for a little bit, Milwaukee, et cetera, but then they actually settled in Omaha before moving to East Lansing or Lansing, Michigan. So Malcolm was born in Omaha, but I bring her to bear with respect to the presentation because of her role in terms of educating Malcolm and all of her children. So many people are aware of Malcolm's love affair with words and language, philology, his love of philosophy, his love of the written word, his love of photography, et cetera. So many people are aware of what he evolved to become in terms of his multiple dimensions, which many of us would identify as a Renaissance individual. But the groundings with respect to the love actually begin with his mother, because when they were children, the little household had a giant dictionary that could be found in the kitchen. So their mother, Louise Little, actually tutored them, not only for their regular schoolwork, but also provided them with news periodicals from Canada, in addition to Garvey papers that would have come out of South America for the chapters that were in spaces like Panama. So multiple languages, not only were the children exposed to, but his mother spoke multiple languages as well, in addition to the fact that she was a writer, in addition to being a reporter for the Garvey newspaper, which was called the Negro World. So his mother is very important in these groundings, because essentially much of what it is that he's able to regain, or I would say revisit, by the time that he actually gets to prison, is based on these fundamental lessons in terms of being able to approach language and also education and study based upon what it is that his mother was able to provide. At this very, very early stage, or this particular phase of his life, this is important with respect to what it actually looks like in terms of how it is that we're defining radical. Some left of center may say, okay, well, it's not radical if you're not critiquing capital, but in that very limited view or scope, then you would obviously rule out somebody like Nathaniel Turner, whose actions are not only considered radical, but actions actually triggered much of what it is that we find with respect to maroonage in terms of actually fighting back against power of enslavement of enslaved individuals in plantation spaces. Or we could also look at the work of David Walker's Appeal, which is also considered a radical treatise. But radical in this sense, meaning that you're always pushing back against hegemony, white supremacy, in addition to all things that are othering and also marginalizing for individuals who are not able to advocate for themselves, whether it be politically or socially. So in this sense, the Louise household, the Louise approach in the Little household is radical based on the fact that his father was a Garveyite preacher, and these young people in the 30s and in the early 40s are being taught that there is no such thing as Negro or something that's identified as being Spanish for Black object, but you are Black people and you are African based on the Garveyism that this household is so imbued with. So I begin with Louise Little in that sense. Now, Malcolm, as he evolved, he spent time in prison based on what actually a mentor to myself, in addition to Dr. Dixon, by the name of Dr. Anderson Thompson, would have said, because Malcolm at this particular point was a zero. And I'll unpack that. So it's someone who ran the street, who was involved in narcotics, who was involved in prostitution, who was involved in the drug trade in Harlem, who was involved in the numbers racket. Malcolm, for the most part, lived the life of an individual who would have been identified as someone who was a zero, based upon them not having a care as to whether or not that their next days would actually be extended because they were living in the moment as he was. So prior to, I would say after his years in East Lansing, then living with his sister-in-law in Boston, in Roxbury, then moving from Boston, riding the train, working on trains, selling sandwiches, et cetera, and then moving up to New York, in which he became like literally arrested by New York, in addition to what it is that Harlem was able to offer. Malcolm was a street individual. Not prior, but during this particular time, not only was he involved in street life, but he was also a burglar. He was also involved in the underworld of Harlem, which leads him to prison. So by the time he's actually in prison, Malcolm becomes most impressed by an inmate. The book will say Bimby, but the gentleman's name was Brimby. But this individual, for the most part, was one who was also incarcerated during the time of Malcolm. And Malcolm understood that, well, this person who he was impressed with, Brimby, when he was in prison, was an individual who had the ability to be able to capture audiences based on his ability to speak, and then also convey information based upon the research and what it is that he was able to consume in the prison libraries. From this point, Malcolm not only understands the need of him being re-educated, but most importantly, the relationship between literacy and then also him being educated in order for him to do additional research while he's in prison. So he rises through the prison ranks, is one who's a formidable individual based on his debating skills, because he joins the prison debate team and he gains notoriety through this particular exercise of debate, in addition to being able to engage in the written word, because he's also involved in the prison newsletter and he's writing articles as well. So his activism is starting at this particular grounded space, in addition to his brothers and sisters introducing him to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, and then also the works of the Nation of Islam, which at this particular point out of Detroit, just moving to Chicago, is a very, very small sect, no more than about 200 to about 250 to about 300 members. So when Malcolm gains his parole, he moves to Michigan and lives with his brother. Then after this, he moves later on to the East Coast. But Malcolm's ascendancy is grounded between his time of entering prison to his time of becoming a national figurehead as a national spokesman or representative for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in addition to the Nation of Islam. But he's able to gain such notoriety at mercurial speed based upon his ability to not only teach, but also his activist ability as well, for someone who's fishing, or what they would actually call recruiting at that particular time for the Nation of Islam. Now, as I spoke as a school leader, which is very important for those who want to study his life, I call stage one the Ostrowski moment, because at that particular point, he's voted to being class president. He wanted to become a lawyer. His 7th grade instructor at that time told him that, well, that was not a profession that he felt that someone who was of his standing, and to be specific, he said that he felt that, well, no nigga could ever become a lawyer. Besides, my people wouldn't hire you to, represent them legally, and your people wouldn't hire you as well. You should become a carpenter. This is your father a carpenter. Jesus was a carpenter. So this is spoken at this particular moment, which is also life-changing, because this would have been his moment in terms of his spirit being killed. And he literally evolves from being a school leader to one who's now a street leader, as I was speaking before. And then the next stage, while he's in prison, not only does he develop a love affair for the written word, in addition to debate, and then also being able to read voraciously, but Malcolm's intellect soars based upon the amount that he's able to consume while he's in prison. And then by the time he actually reaches the Nation of Islam from 1952 to approximately 1963, not 64, then he's the general national representative for the NOI. But most importantly, Malcolm is opening up temples nationally, and in some cases, holding multiple posts simultaneously. So, for example, he's leading the Harlem Mosque, but also opening up and having a travel back and forth between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. So he's active in terms of recruitment, meeting with young people, holding national engagements with respect to lectures at colleges and universities. And he's literally almost moving at a pace that many can't even necessarily believe, based upon the demand for who he has become at this particular point. Post his time with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm becomes an international Pan-Africanist leader up until his death or assassination in 1965. So many would argue that in these life stages, Malcolm literally is one who's not only lived 3 and 4 lives, but at each particular stage, there's something different that we're able to learn with respect to what it is he's able to provide his audiences and those who he comes in contact with, is someone who's not just a political leader, but most importantly, I keep going back to this, one who is an educator. And I'm going to unpack more of that in the next few slides. So a few things, a few markers that I just wanted to unpack in terms of Malcolm's ascendancy and these turning points. So the Hinton Johnson incident is something that takes place when Malcolm is in Harlem. So an NOI individual who was actually selling newspapers was the victim of police brutality in Harlem. And when he was attacked and also brutalized, Malcolm had control of the Nation of Islam's Fruit of Islam, which is the paramilitary force or faction of the NOI that was present at that particular time in Harlem coming out of that particular mosque. The reason I have this here is because the political and then also civic leadership within the city understood the amount of influence in addition to what his capabilities actually could lead to in the event that he wanted to have an uprising based upon that level of influence. So that's why I put that there. The remarks that he provided in addition to how he was able to orchestrate this next bullet right here, the hate that hate produced, was a documentary that Malcolm had pushed to have made for the purposes of really bringing notoriety to the Nation of Islam, but most importantly, became a recruitment tool based upon those who had no idea that the Lost Foundation was even in existence, let alone the number of individuals who actually belong to the Nation of Islam from coast to coast. And one of the best sayings that actually goes along with the number or the growth of the Nation of Islam from 52 up until about 1960 is when Malcolm was asked on a public invitation in order to do a debate, what was the number of individuals with the Nation of Islam? And Malcolm simply said, I don't know. And then he said, and then the commentator responded, well, I heard it's this number. Well, Malcolm just simply said, well, those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. So essentially stating that the number could be vast, it could be mediocre, but at the end of the day, it's something that we don't necessarily have to express based on those who are card-carrying members of the Nation of Islam, in addition to the members who are be identified as sympathizers or fellow travelers. I won't go through the rest, but the last bullet is extremely important because this is a turning point with respect to Malcolm being not only ostracized, but having to pivot to become independent of the organization that provided him with a platform. But that's John F. Kennedy's assassination and the line that essentially got him barred from the Nation of Islam, in addition to other factors. But this was a culminating point of which he was asked about how he felt about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He said, well, I just felt that it was a climate of hate that was being produced globally, and it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost, in which he stated that never made him sad because he was an old farm boy and made him glad. So this last bullet is important as well in terms of looking at the rise of Malcolm, and then in each particular term, whether it's through the media or through writings, et cetera, in which you could actually see his growth, his development, what actually leads him to the next phases of his career. Now, in terms of what Malcolm was able to provide over the breadth of his career, I think that, and this is going back to Dr. Dixon's question at the beginning, so why am I looking at Malcolm, and what actually put me in a position, or what were some of the contributing factors as it relates to looking at Malcolm as someone beyond just a political head, an individual who was tied to the Organization of Afro-American Unity or the Nation of Islam? What was it that was most attractive that I wanted to tease out with respect to the research, specifically around what Malcolm was able to provide in terms of his educational influence that in many cases, most persons don't necessarily lend to or attribute to Malcolm in terms of being an educator. So the first thing I look at is his love affair with literacy. So when Malcolm was in prison, one of the key things that I think people aren't aware of is the voracious appetite that he had for information that developed once he was able to see that there was a high level of gravitas and influence that he was able to wield based upon what it is that he knew. So for example, a reporter called Malcolm to ask him a series of questions for an article that was being run, and the reporter was coming from the United Kingdom. So toward the end of the interview, he asked Malcolm what his alma mater was. And Malcolm just simply stated books. That's my alma mater. So essentially, Malcolm loved reading in addition to reading, but he had a love affair with language specifically. So he studied philology in addition to Greeks, in addition to Greek mythology, in addition to all things historical, all things, dealing with the social, political, and most importantly, transnational information for colonization and what imperialism really looked like with respect to the historical accounts. So he had a love affair with multiple streams of information. In addition to obviously wanting to become a lawyer, because that was his initial motivation when he was a grade school student before the Ostrovsky moment. So Malcolm had a love affair with literacy, which brought him to the the uses of history and the uses of information of history that he would always utilize in his speeches to preface most of what it is that he spoke to. So Malcolm would state things like, if you don't know the beginning of the origin point of a particular thing or able to actually capture or look at the historical aspect of it, then you're always looking at things fragmented or in a silo because you don't know the beginning of a thing. So if you don't, then now you're investigating from the position of someone who's cut off. So his utilization of history was extremely important based upon how it is that he would always ground his information and always ground his speeches. In addition to how it is that he taught, because he had a minister's training class when he was with the Nation of Islam that had a group of ministers in which he required them to carry a dictionary, a thesaurus, and anywhere between 3 to 5 news periodicals that included the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Peking Review, and then also there was another paper from London as well. But all of these papers, Malcolm would have his ministers carry because he wanted them to make the connection between the contemporary and what was taking place historical as well, because it was always a thread. There was nothing that was fragmented. So the uses of history and the way that he used history to teach always connected to the contemporary. His ability to be self-accountable and self-critical is important as well. There are a number of examples, but one that always sticks out is when Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam by late 1963, going into 1964, when he was about maybe 6 months before his assassination, he had written a letter to one of his cousins stating that he wished he could go back and unteach most of what he actually had taught that he thought was misogynistic, because he felt that he had taught the brothers to spit acid at the sisters. So in this moment, he's not only critiquing what it is that he had done, but he's being self-critical based on what it is that he felt that those brothers who or sisters who stood in front of him or sat in front of his classes in the Nation of Islam, specifically in Temple number 7, if they didn't benefit from what it is that the true information should have been, he felt that there was something that he would have been able to or should have been able to go back and teach if he had enough time. The next bullet, mass appeal and the use emphasis, is extremely important because Malcolm always felt, especially between the years of about 1962 and 1964, that the next generation, or what he identified as the students, would be extremely important with respect to the Black liberation movement, not just domestically, but also transnationally. And more specifically, he had a high level of encouragement for those like Max Stanford, in addition to the students, or what he identified as students who were with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to actually do more community-based work, in addition to making the connection between things North and South. Or as he would always say, stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. So Malcolm had a high level of respect for young people and always wanted to engage in young people for conversation and also debate, to keep his own sword sharpened for the purpose of ensuring that he stayed relevant for the contemporary audiences while being able to attract the next generations of individuals who now become the leaders of what we identify as the Black Power movement. And the last one is extremely important. When I was working on my book, when I was working on my dissertation, one of the best interviews I had was with one of his former staff persons, and then also good friends by the name of James 67X, who later became Brother Abdul Razak. But I asked him, so can you talk to me about Malcolm as an activist? And I didn't necessarily see a lot of what it is that he had done as being activism. And I don't know why I didn't make the connection at that particular point, but it was probably the funniest thing, because he said Malcolm was always active. He said demonstrations, whether they took place in Harlem or in Brooklyn, Malcolm was there. When Malcolm had to be called to Los Angeles when the temple got raided, he was one of the first persons on the scene after flying from New York to Los Angeles and staying active in the legal case, et cetera. So Malcolm was always present and engaging, not just in matters dealing with the Nation of Islam, but matters whether it was CORE in Brooklyn or whether it was the NAACP Junior League or persons out in the Bay Area, or being active for the purposes of building new temples. He understood that not only was his life a dedicated representation of work, but education itself is a call to work, because understanding you cannot teach. You cannot be an activist and you can't be one who's on the front line identifying as someone who is radicalized if you're misinformed or uninformed. So his call to work was always based on what it is that he was able to inform not only his ministers, but also those individuals who he was responsible for the temples for which he was able to shepherd. And I think one of the greatest examples of him being the embodiment of a call to work is his ushering in not only the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which is post his years with the Nation of Islam, but the OAAU Liberation School that he was insisting on establishing for the purpose of ensuring that the adults and older youth in the upper Manhattan, specifically Harlem and the Bronx area, would be able to take advantage of his continuing education, because he wanted to ensure that they receive not only a multitude of perspectives with respect to radicalized thought, but that education was going to be tantamount for those individuals who wanted to become the next activists who came out of the OAAU. So these are just a few things that I want to point out with respect to his philosophies around education. Now, this is important for me because I don't think a lot of people have actually seen this. So I'm going to take a quick pause in order for the audience to get a good look at who this woman is and this legend of a woman is and what it is that she's holding. Then I'm going to unpack this so I can begin to break down some of these lines of demarcation with respect to how it is that we think we understand history. So Dr. Dixon, real quick, does your class or your audience, are they aware of who this woman is?
Yes, we are aware here at the University of Wyoming in this classroom. We are very aware. Under all circumstances, I think they'll be very interested in your take on how you connect these two, because I think that is indeed very needed for a comprehensive understanding.
So we all understand that this is Rosa Parks. First and foremost, she did not sit down because she was tired or her feet hurt. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as an activist, she was not an old woman by the time she actually was engaging within the Montgomery Improvement Association boycott, as one who was trained at the Highlander Folk School, along with Septima Clark, in addition to Ella Baker. So she's trained first and foremost. And second of all, her first call did not go to her husband and went to Edie Nixon, who was a Pullman porter and also a communist out of Alabama, who was an activist prior to Martin King even coming to Montgomery. So those are a few things that I really want to establish. But Rosa Parks is important in this particular sense because most folks don't know about her life after leaving Montgomery, having to go up to Detroit and continue her activism with groups like the Detroit area Friends of SNCC, in addition to working along many political campaigns and also activist campaigns that were radical. She's holding this poster at this conference, and the way that she's looking at this poster, there's subtext and a story behind the story. If you look at the work of Jean Theo Harris and the work of the radicalized life of Rosa Parks, the reason I have this here is because it's always a connection, a thread. They're not separate. And this continuum of intergenerational relationships between someone like Parks and someone like Malcolm is extremely important. So Rosa Parks said that not only did she love Malcolm, but Malcolm reminded her of her grandfather, who kept a shotgun in his front porch when she was a little girl living down south. In addition to the fact that she was more in tune and calibrated with the message that Malcolm was sending, more so than that of what it is that Martin King had been providing, as someone for the most part who went from civil to slightly human, but most importantly, poor people's manifestation by the time of his death. But she aligned with Malcolm X. That's why this clip is important, in addition to understanding the intergenerational relationships of someone like Rosa Parks had with the greater movement that was radicalized, that she had more gravitas to. So that's why I have this up. So this clip I'm going to play, and what I really want to pull out from this clip is not Malcolm the firebrand, but Malcolm the educator that many of us don't get to see. As you look at the embodiment of someone who's using literacy, history, in addition to having mass appeal for young people, and also what it actually looks like to be able to wed these intelligences and the ability to be able to address a crowd as someone who's an educator, not someone who's encapsulated with this phrase, by any means necessary. So this is much greater than that. So just bear with me a few minutes and just check out this clip.
Return to the Nation of Islam.
As a matter of fact, I just need to make sure, can everybody hear? Because I know sometimes I got to go back and I guess check the sound to allow sound when I'm sharing the screen. So can you hear this?
Per se, Minister.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Question, which struck me as a result of reading some of Baldwin's work, namely The Fire Next Time. Baldwin pointed out that in Harlem for many years, he had passed the street corners and the soapboxes and heard people speaking from these platforms who were known as Black nationalists, and nobody was listening. And he said all of a sudden he realized that people were beginning to listen to the Muslim speakers on the street corners in Harlem. The message essentially was the same, but it was that now many people were listening to what this message was. And you pointed out that the Nation of Islam has been in the picture for about 33 years. What is it, in your judgment, that has caused this tremendous amount of support that the Nation of Islam has garnered in the Negro community in, say, the last 10 years?
When you put a seed in the soil, it remains beneath the soil until the season changes. And when the season changes, that the seasonal change automatically brings about rather atmospheric conditions, bring about a seasonal change that makes that seed come up or crop grow in its appointed time. And all over this world today, God himself has brought about political changes, a political atmosphere, sociological, social atmosphere, economic atmosphere. These economic conditions, these political conditions and social conditions combine to bring about a situation that is making Black people in America more receptive, their mind more fertile to the seed of truth that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has been planting for 30 some years. And this is springing up today and causing our people to see and understand now what they couldn't see and understand before.
What is the nature of this situation which is making Black people more receptive?
Well, you take in the past, say 15 years, how the nations have emerged, dark nations have emerged in Africa. Prior to 10 years ago, most Negroes identified Africa with a savage jungle-like place. And whenever you mentioned the word African, in their mind's eye, they could see the image of someone running around with a spear, with no language. You'd say Ugga Bugga Boo or Bwana or something, and who'd be in a jungle running from lions or chasing lions. But then when, after the war, when the United Nations was set up in New York City, Black people began to look at men like Tom Mboya. They began to look at men like Nkrumah. They began to see men like Lumumba. They began to see men like Nasser. They began to see these Belowa and Azikwe, who could exchange intellectually with whites on an international level in a political forum and hold their own. This made the Black people in this country realize that
I'm going to skip forward in the interest of time. We can come back and unpack that clip, but I now want to actually move forward to Malcolm and his impact with youth. And then I'll come back and unpack some of the political stuff in the Q&A. So Malcolm, it was a couple of days before Thanksgiving, 1962, in which he actually met Muhammad Ahmed, formerly Maxwell Stanford, who was one of the founding members of the Revolutionary Action Movement. So he encouraged Max Stanford, who wanted to join the Nation of Islam at that point by 62, to actually become a mobilizing force on this college campus coming out of Case Western, Ohio, in addition to having relationships in Philadelphia to start the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM. So Malcolm, in many cases or in many ways, is the, I would say, kind of like the founding influence with respect to Ronald Freeman, in addition to Muhammad Ahmed, and also, I'm blocking on the other name or whatever, but Roland Snellings, who became Askia Touré, who is big part of the Black Arts Movement. But Malcolm is a grounding force with respect to the development and also the evolution and founding of RAM. But one of the most important things is, at this particular point, is this development of what the Panthers would have identified as the lumpen mentality of individuals who, for the most part, were street organizations who are now becoming politicized. in between the years of about 1966 and about 1968, 69. Nationally, you now begin to see young people who were moving or evolving out of street organizations to now become leaders within their communities because they were becoming politicized. In each one of these cases, especially for those of the Young Lords organization, which actually starts in the Lakeview, in addition to Humboldt Park neighborhoods out of Chicago, and in addition to the Panther Party for the third iteration. I say third because the first is in Alabama, the second is in New York with Bill Epton, and then the third comes out of Oakland. But in each case, when they had their political education workshops and seminars and their organizing tactics that would utilize information, the two things, well, three, for example. So you had the Red Book, because most of the organizations were definitely left of center. But in addition to the other two, you would always have long play records in which young people played speeches of Malcolm, and then also the autobiography, which would become standard mandatory reading for most members coming into these organizations. So street gang into street organization transformation is also triggered based upon young persons becoming politicized who now see themselves within a greater political fold and not just on the external or on the periphery as someone who's a non-participant, but now is becoming political actors in their organizations. Another thing that's transforming are the school spaces. So you can see in the upper left, you have a registration table for Malcolm X at Rice University that took place in Raleigh-Durham, then moving to Greensboro, North Carolina, as a part of the independent Black institution movement that included schools out of Chicago, such as the Q University, the schools out of Brooklyn, New York, who would have been with J2AUC and the East Organization, schools out of Atlanta, such as the Pan-African Skills Center, schools in the Bay Area, Nairobi, such as Nairobi College, and then also student organizations as well to work in conjunction with schools that saw themselves as being the legacies of individuals who are now carrying on the work of Malcolm. So you see down here, these pictures, especially this one right here with this baby holding this placard, and then this social movement taking place right here. This particular parade are actually the outpourings of African Liberation Day, which grounds itself in something much greater than just ALD or African Freedom Day, but most importantly, a unified practice that's global, and then also anti-imperialistic, anti-hegemonic, and most importantly, anti-colonial. But these groundings are found in many of the teachings that are now being purveyed through what it is that these young people are learning within these school spaces that they've been able to construct as being the legacies, or what Julius Lester would say in his work, the angry children of Malcolm X. Now, this is important. This slide is extremely important to me. Most importantly, this one right here, I probably should have just had this pick up by itself, because this particular photograph, or this photograph in terms of young people within this store, this is Elder Michaud's bookstore in Harlem, which would have been called the House of Consciousness and the place of proper propaganda. So Malcolm spent many a days here increasing his own education to the point that on many a night he would just sleep in the basement of Elder Michaud's bookstore. But this is what I would identify in other historians who are engaged within this work of understanding Black political praxis, education, and curriculum development within the Black freedom struggle is a maroon space or a fugitive space. Most importantly, a counter-hegemonic space of radical thought and learning, a bookstore. So in this bookstore, young people are reading more. Not only are they reading more, but the connections aren't local, they're global. They're connecting what's taking place in Harlem with what will be taking place in South Africa. They make connections to understand how you can be a part of an intercommunal colony within the US, as well as have a connection with someone who would be in Soweto or Johannesburg or Cape Town or Mozambique, having these relationships between imperialism, but then also understanding what it looks like to be a victim of a police state. All of these connections are being made because young people are engaging more within bookstore spaces such as this right here. And most importantly, this last point I make here, students forming study groups and attending college nationwide. So this generation of folks by this time has actually been able to witness the sit-ins, the wait-ins, the stand-ins, et cetera. And now they find themselves in college. And now in college, not necessarily wanting to undertake or engage in the same tactics as the older generation that they saw when they were in their young teens and their teenage years, but now moving toward what it is that they're identifying as being a part of a larger struggle that goes from Black power to nation time to we are an African people by the time we get to 1972. But literacy and reading is extremely important. And then also beyond credit hour production, most importantly, forming study groups in order to be able to engage analytically in much of what it is that they're learning about and then also experiencing in real time. I'm going to skip for the sake of time. This last post is important to me because I'm often asked about the contemporary relevancy of Malcolm. So this young lady right here, her name is Mariah Parker. She took on a post as a Georgia, as an official, as a political official here in Georgia back in 2018, June, if I'm not mistaken. And she actually is sworn in for this post, and she requested that she was sworn in on Malcolm's autobiography. So just to show the relevance of Malcolm to a contemporary audience for those who are still trying to understand and then make connections with their lives in this political moment that is still very peculiar. And we're still attempting to try to understand more, but you still see the relevance of Malcolm some 60 years later. So I'm going to conclude my presentation there and open up the space for questions. And we can go ahead and get those started whenever you're ready, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you, sir. Well done. Thank you so much for the ability to connect Malcolm from his womb until his tomb.
Yes, sir.
And the relevancy of what I thought was very important, and we discussed as we were paying strict attention. The class discussed the idea of the importance of informal education. So we were able to have that as a takeaway and to be able to add to the legacy of Malcolm. And when I look at it, we got a couple questions, so we want to go right into them if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Right. Questions from the class say, which stage of Malcolm's life would you say impacted him and his legacy the most?
I would argue his prison years, which would have been about stage 3, in addition to his years when fresh out of prison, which would have been stage 4, in which he emerges as a national spokesman to later become, I would say national and to some degree international spokesman, but someone who has probably more of a local following, which would have been 1952 until about 1963, 64 with the Nation of Islam. He learns how to become an activist. And prior to that, when he was in prison, he literally, for the most part, those would have been the years as a young person that he would have experienced as an undergraduate all the way up to about, graduate space and age of education, whatever. But he actually studied, everything under the sun with respect to being able to sharpen his intellect. I left out something in terms of one of his nephews by the name of Rodnell P. Collins, when he was with his mother, who was Malcolm's half sister named Ella Collins, would actually sneak law books into the prison for Malcolm to be able to read because one of the libraries did not have law books. So we're talking about somebody who was a voracious reader, but most importantly, he was sharpening his analysis. So by the time he's released from prison in 52 and joins the Nation of Islam, now he has the he has enough zealotry in addition to motivation to want to be able to utilize the information in a very pragmatic sense to now become an activist, to recruit and help to build, this organization into an international powerhouse. So I think those two stages are probably extremely important because we see much of what it is that the fruits of that labor of those periods are able to provide in terms of his overall life.
Thank you. Excellent way to give that analysis. Move right into the next one. And we got a few. So I'm hoping we can hang on here. What influence do you think that Betty Shabazz played in the development as a leader, part 1? Do you think her contribution is often undervalued?
definitely undervalued. And I think most importantly, the life of Betty Shabazz, formerly Betty Saunders, deserves more critical examination. In, I think, one of the books you could probably read that would give you a grounding, just I would say a rudimentary grounding in terms of who she was and who she became post Malcolm's death, is On the Life of On Her Life, written by an author or scholar by the name of Russell Rickford. So he wrote that particular book actually prior to getting his PhD. I think many people actually know him for the book that he has written called We Are an African People, that looks at the CB schools, but he had written a book as a journalist prior to his PhD on the life of Betty Shabazz. The role that she plays in terms of Malcolm's development is key, because she too is being a high-level learner and also intellect in addition to progenitor of education is extremely important, but also provides Malcolm with balance, because we're talking about someone who averaged 4 hours of sleep per day. So now him being a family man is now adding to the balance that's going to be necessary in order for him to become a more empathetic and then also effectual leader within space in which he's going to have to consider not only one side, but also other individuals as it relates to how it is that he's going to move in leadership capacity. He's learning that in his own house, in addition to dealing with someone who's able to match him intellectually within this house, as well as he's becoming a husband, as he's becoming a father. So she's extremely important. And I think she's undervalued with respect to his overall advancements and then his overall maturation as well. But I think you can see much of who it is that she was within the marriage, and then also who it is that she was prior to meeting Malcolm in the years of her activism post Malcolm's death. Most importantly, as she's making her rounds and forming alliances with Coretta Scott King as well, who's also undervalued with respect to her presence and also intellect and also influence as it relates to Martin King.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent question, which was forwarded to us by our Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Pudu, and she gives a
Great question.
yeah, and she uses to follow it up. She loves Malcolm's quote, "Education is the passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs for those who prepare for it today." I think many of us have heard that. We have another question, which is a two-part question.
Okay.
Do you think if Malcolm X didn't have as much informal education in his early childhood from his parents, would he still have been such an influential, informal educator himself? Part one. Part two, was the informal education he received a form of Black generational wealth? Excellent question.
Question two first.
Okay.
And I appreciate the question, because in many cases, to most, we actually commodify what it is that wealth could actually be with respect to its utility. So in this particular instance, I refer back to or refer to a book also written by a former mentor of myself and Dr. Dixon, which would be Dr. James D. Anderson's book, but looking at the groundings of what it is that education was able to provide beyond anything that would have been considered monetary or being able to utilize, as, particular commodity of exchange. So in this sense, now we're looking at the ability to be able to provide information, analysis, and then also an approach to how to navigate space that was obviously offered from his mother to folks like his sister, his wife, his sister Etta Collins, his wife Betty Shabazz or Betty X, in addition to Vicki Garvin, in addition to Maya Angelou, in addition to Sonia Sanchez. I mean, so there's a literal thread of women, in addition to other individuals who actually play a major role within this legacy, which add to the question around generational wealth. In this case, I definitely agree that Malcolm's upbringing is important and is key, because much of what it is, and I made this point earlier, that he's able to reclaim at this time by stage 3 when he's in prison, is based on the groundings that he received as relates to his parents' loving and education, his mother specifically even more, being someone who provided the tutelage. So the dictionary was a very old, I would say, it was a very old way for him to engage within the literacy component as something that it was introduced to him as a child. I don't know if he would have been able to find his way back in such a way that would have allowed him to have the same love affair if not having had, that grounded influence that his mother had provided. I think he probably still would have been able to find a way to not only become who he became, but having those types of tools makes a life for someone who's obviously has a love affair with learning a lot easier. So it's so hard to say, but I don't think we could imagine the Malcolm that we get at this particular point, or the Malcolm by age 39 who becomes an international figure. It's hard to imagine him without having had the influence of his mother in his life. In addition to that, by the time Malcolm was 38, he was able to get his mother liberated or freed or released from the mental institution that she had been placed in, and she had been held in for about 20 years after she had a mental breakdown when her husband and their children, etc., were separated. But after her husband was killed and the children were separated, she had been declared unfit and also identified as someone who was paranoid schizophrenic. So Malcolm gets her release, and the quote that he stated was that he, in addition to his other siblings, would never be able to move forward and amount to what it is that they could fully become as people unless they got their mother released from prison. So I say that to state that she's in a very important force, but underwritten about with respect to his overall trajectory and being as an international icon. So that's why I state.
All right. Well, thank you for that question. We got a couple more. We want to
Okay, no problem.
keep moving. Okay, well, how about two more?
No problem.
All right, here we go. Another student asked, was there a significant influence on Malcolm's talent and love for reading and knowledge expansion during the time he was in prison on the action he advocated for?
Repeat the question one more time.
Okay. Was there a significant influence on Malcolm's talent and love for reading and knowledge expansion during his time in prison on the action he eventually advocated for?
I hope I'm answering this correctly.
Okay.
So yes to the question, and the example that I'm thinking of is when Malcolm is now moving in terms of identifying as not only being a Muslim in prison, but also utilizing this newfound skill set of debate, writing, and his ability to be able to communicate within prison based on what is now leading his life as someone who's now become a follower of Elijah Muhammad in the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm, whose activism begins prior to joining the Nation of Islam while he's still in prison with other inmates, wanted to have cells like literal prison spaces where their houses were, cells that face the east, in addition to dietary considerations because they were Muslim, food with no pork, etc., that was allowed while they were incarcerated. And they also protested, signed petitions, and he sent a number of letters to the governor at that particular time. So he had already been on their radar prior to being released. So Malcolm's activism and his love affair with education actually led him to have his first forays into the realm of advocating as a Muslim, in addition to an activist while still in prison, based on the tools that he was able to develop while he was going through these years of development while he was incarcerated. I hope I answered your question, but that's for the most part what it is that I glean in terms of Malcolm's development, in terms of his love, what he had a love affair for, which was be able to help people, in addition to his role in terms of developing while he was in prison as well.
Well, to answer your question, Sam said you absolutely answered his question.
All right, no problem.
All right, so how about one more? And this is from Dr. Marcus Watson at Buffalo State University. And
Okay.
he asked this question: did Malcolm study, read about African forms of education, call and response, storytelling by elders?
Yes, and the the examples that I'm thinking most of in terms of his level of study can be attributed to, well, one particular force, and when I say force, I'm talking about the force of influence as a historian, but more specifically his relationship with John Henry Clark. So Clark, as many of us know, who passed in I want to say it was in 98, but Clark, who would have been a part of a shadow cabinet, along with Adam Clayton Powell, in addition to Dr. Ben during Malcolm's time when he was in Harlem, was influential with respect to providing Malcolm with what he would
John
identify
Henry Clark.
as folders. So he said it would compile folders of information for Malcolm in order for him to not only prep for debates, in addition to other speeches, et cetera, but John Henry Clark's level of influence, in addition to Malcolm's voracious reading or appetite for being able to read not only periodicals, newspapers, et cetera, but also his love affair with just books in a general sense, prepped him in order to be able to not only understand audiences, but the level of impact that he would have with respect to whether it was a college audience or a street audience or audience in Philadelphia versus that in New York or Harlem. So that said, Malcolm had a very keen sense in terms of not only what the general African traditions from a Jele and a Jegna meant in terms of being able to address audiences, and also his relationships with contemporary individuals, such as those we understand who were his fellow travelers who did not join the Nation of Islam, but who had relationships with Malcolm, such as we identify, the late great Red Fox, who worked with Malcolm in Small's Paradise, et cetera, when he was actually coming up the ranks as an entertainer, told Malcolm that at some point you're going to have to make the people laugh when you're giving these speeches. So we understood that there was a nuanced perspective that he gained from not only study, information from individuals who are scholars, in addition to persons who understood audience and the rhythm of spaces as well. And I would say, and as all of these factors collapse and attribute to who it is that he was able to understand himself to be as he stood in front of an audience, is taken into account with respect to how it is that he would teach, and most importantly, lecture, and also be able to address spaces as well. Now I can think of about two instances in terms of him not only teaching about this in a particular sense, but one when he was speaking to Benjamin Goodman, who had to lecture in front of a Philadelphian audience. And he told or gave an example using, while speaking to the Philadelphia audience about household pests, PESTS, as related to how it is that he was trying to drive home a point. But the message wasn't received well. Malcolm got word or received word of how it is that Goodman didn't necessarily have the best outing for this speech that he gave in Philadelphia. And one of the first things that he said to Benjamin Goodman, who was Benjamin 10X at the time, was essentially, well, the Philadelphia audience, based on history, based on individuals in class, et cetera, is going to be much different from the audience that you find in Harlem. So you wouldn't be able to use that particular example in terms of being able to address this crowd. So you always have to know who it is that you're speaking to, and then what it is that they're going to resonate with in terms of how it is that you're delivering the information as well. So that's one example. But Malcolm definitely was trained in particular traditions, but also had a high level of familiarity with himself as an intergenerational actor or force within those traditions as well. So yes, he did study.
Absolutely. It's ironic that you just mentioned John Henry Clark, because we had a very provocative quote that we used today in class, and it resonates now. And I have to explain, Dr. Benson, that you are this is an excellent presentation, because literally our class stopped at 7 o'clock, and up until the last minute, you had almost 14 or 15 people still here listening, and we have a very small crowd now, but they're still very engaged. So that goes to show you that this is a very necessary way of giving Malcolm a different venue and a different vein of reasoning. Yeah. So when I think about the last piece, and I just like to wrap it up with this, you talked about, that was one of the bullet points where you talked about essentially relevancy and Malcolm's legacy. I think about what many people know that during the 70s, we see that as the same time that you're discussing, we see that this is Malcolm X's autobiography becomes the most stolen book from the New York Library, which is introducing another generation to have this experience with Malcolm after he's no longer in the physical form.
Right.
But then again, we see it pop its head up again in a very direct and specific way right around 1987, 88, when we see KRS-One and this album cover. So we see these different venues that Malcolm is reintroduced to many groups. Now, how do we tie that today to what we know as Malcolm being securely fastened and marginalized to one coined term? And then more specifically, how do we look at Malcolm's legacy? And let's say this, maybe his legacy assassination, when we think of Malcolm now being on a United States stamp.
Well, it's funny because I think in many cases, much of what it is that we would have looked forward to actually counter, whether it's pathological institutions, behavior, individuals who try to disrupt Blackness, or I would say not only Blackness, but also progressive thought, liberal thought, those who really want to radicalize for the purposes of moving on beyond becoming just a cog in the wheel. At many points, those things that we would have used, as ammunition can in many cases be weaponized against us. And I think Martin Luther King's Santa Clausification is probably one of those prime examples. So it doesn't, shock me that Malcolm would be on a stamp. But I think the other piece, or the other, to your question, in terms of Malcolm's relationship with a contemporary, and what that looks like, what that looks like for young people now in terms of having a resurgence, whether it's due to Netflix or whether it's due to Amazon Prime in terms of A Night in Miami, or another documentary talking about the relationship between him and Muhammad Ali as blood brothers, whatever the case may be. I think that young people are still searching for answers in terms of what the General Liberation Project is going to look like as it relates to being the antithesis to this particular stage of the colonial project. I still think Malcolm provides those answers. I think much of what it is that he stated, whether it was in print or whether it was in the form of a speech or whether it was on a radio program, it resonates because it moves beyond anything that's apologetic, and it does not kowtow to any aspect of respectability for the purposes of making others feel comfortable. So his brash approach, his ability to be able to speak truth to power, and most importantly, encourage those to prove him wrong if you felt that what it is that he was stating in some way, shape, or form was erroneous. It gives people a new form of confidence in a way to be critical of whatever the standings of power exists now, to move beyond to say this is something that we can't overcome because those prior to us who walked before us were able to do it in this particular fashion. And this person that we're still using as a muse 60 years later is still relevant with respect to what he is saying, what she is saying. I think contemporarily, young people are still looking for that. And whether they find it in Malcolm or they find it, when someone 2 generations removed from Malcolm, it is significant as it relates to the overall intergenerational project. And I'm going to use the portion of the question from one of your previous students in terms of what it actually looks like to build that aspect of Black generational wealth, in terms of thought, in terms of provocative action, and most importantly, in terms of radical education as well. So I think those are some key things that maintained Malcolm's interface to the now.
Well, I thank you so much for giving us your time. A very thoughtful presentation that gets to the core of how we can continue to expand the conversation on our dear brother Malcolm, particularly when you think about formal and informal education, which I think that some of the students tonight began to be able to deconstruct and found it very important to be able to inject his early life, and that's what we call it, into what we know. I think it was very interesting how you mentioned the young man who eventually becomes Brother Baines in the movie, right? And
Yeah.
that's pretty important. But I want to take a step back to go to that. I think during that time when we begin to see Warner Brothers become very interested in having a say, if not guiding the defined direction about what Malcolm legacy would look like at that time. So I think it's profitable, and we know what that means to Hollywood.
Right.
There are no bounds to that capitalistic, imperialistic thought.
Right.
But to be able to control the narrative,
Yeah.
I think that your research interrupts that. And it puts us in a position where we need to be more diligent with our own research.
Yeah, definitely. As many of our previous mentors would always state, that our job is to continue to research the research. So
I mean, now you really get to the heart of the core when you say research your researcher. That's
Yes, sir.
absolutely true. Well, if you got any last thoughts, we really appreciate you being here. And to say that we got something out of this would be a mere understatement. But, you know, I always appreciate you always saying yes and always being available. So I thank you so much. And if you want to give us your parting thoughts.
just thank you for having me. And again, you know, from the words of Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, study, 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 study and struggle, study and struggle. So that's, you know, for the most part, that's really what I want to add. So, you know, thank you everybody for joining, taking the time to listen. And I'm much appreciative of what it is that you provided in terms of questions, pushing me to continue to think more as I'm working on the next projects that involve Malcolm. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I think it'd be more than apropos to inject what the great Frederick Douglass said: agitate, agitate, agitate.
Yes, sir.
Well, I thank you so much. Can you hold on for 1 second?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone who came out. I think we were highly put in a position of how do we continue to expand the dominant discourse. And I think we were well satisfied and fully fed. So I thank Dr. Benson for coming out, and the Black Studies Center appreciates your time and your effort to prepare for this particular presentation. So I